Hi, everyone. Before we begin, I'll share a couple of procedural things. You may notice the chat function has been disabled, but throughout the presentation, please use the Q&A function. Our speaker will be asking for some engagement, some responses, and you're welcome to use the Q&A function to participate, and I'll be engaging in dialogue with him about that. You can also use that if you need to get in touch with one of us with any issues. You can use the Q&A function to reach out to me and to Jason to troubleshoot any tech stuff for you or anything along those lines. There will also be a survey at the end of the webinar shared with you, and I hope you do take a moment to take it. It helps us know both how you like this webinar and what you'd like to see for upcoming webinars. You will notice that this webinar is being recorded and it will be posted to Ava's YouTube channel shortly. So you can revisit and share this webinar and also check out our previous webinars. After I do the introduction, I will post a link in the chat where you can access past and upcoming webinars. And without further ado, welcome to the Alliance Against Violence and Adversities Webinar Wednesdays. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Yursich, an early career researcher with AVA and lead on the webinar series alongside my amazing colleagues, Jason and Andrea. Outside of that role, I'm the co-director for the Frida Center for Research on Violence Against Women, Children, and Gender Diverse Peoples and faculty at Capilano University. I'm joining you today from the unceded traditional and ancestral territories of the Coquitlam First Nation, and on behalf of AVA, I want to begin by acknowledging that, on a national level, we encourage all Canadians and visitors to Canada to learn about the Indigenous peoples of the lands on which they live, work, or visit, and become engaged allies together. We, as Canadians, in the spirit of truth and reconciliation, respect the self-determination of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and their rights and responsibilities in cultures, languages, and the pursuit of wellness. The focus of today's webinar is entitled Queer Epistemologies of Violence, Ecological and Liberatory Perspectives. We are joined by Dr. Jason, or J. C. Garvey, from the University of Vermont. He is a principal investigator of the QTPiE initiative for queer and trans people in education, the executive director of the Office of Institutional Research and Assessment, and the Friedman Hipps Green and Gold, and a professor in education at the University of Vermont. Jay, thank you so much for joining us today. It's an honor to have you here.
Thanks so much. I'm pleased as punch to be here. Give me a second, I'll share my screen and then we'll get rolling. All right, how are we looking?
Looks good.
Perfect. Well, I'm so glad that we started with centering ourselves in a land acknowledgement. I want to continue by sharing that I'm joining you from the unceded lands of the Abenaki people who steward these lands now known as Vermont. I want to begin by honoring their ongoing presence and care and leadership, and especially recognize the conversation that we're having today about violence and violence prevention and liberation sits directly within the history of colonization and of erasure and of resilience. Especially relevant to my talk is what I've learned from Indigenous statisticians about data sovereignty, or an individual and collective community agency and inherent rights for how people collect, use, and dispose of our information. As was shared, my name is Jay, and I use he, him pronouns. My work sits at the intersection of data and dignity. I proudly identify as a quantitative queer, and I take great interest in understanding how care and dignity and inherent worth are situated within data systems. And as PI of the Queer and Trans People in Education Research Collective, I wanted to acknowledge and celebrate my colleague and dear friend Dolan. Much of what I share today is the product of our collective thinking and writing and imagining together. The heart of my work, and really of this talk, is the belief that numbers and stories and relationships can all be tools of liberation if we approach them with intention and humility and with love. Today, I want to think with you about how queer ways of knowing and queer epistemologies can help us reimagine violence prevention, not just as a set of interventions, but as a relational, systemic, and ecological practice. As an education scholar and as a teacher and as an administrator, I'll often ground this conceptual conversation today within my own area of expertise, which is policies and practices that uplift queer and trans people in education. I find great power in examining the interrelatedness and distinctions across public and private sectors. So as I continue in my talk, I encourage you to consider your own framing as we progress through these conceptual conversations together. Throughout our time together, I'll be introducing what I call pedagogical pauses. These pauses are intentional breaks in the flow of information. It's a moment for us to breathe collectively and individually, for us to reflect, and to connect ideas to our own lived experiences. They come from my teaching practices and from community-based facilitation models like restorative practices. I use pedagogical pauses for 3 reasons. The first is to promote deep reflection, because these topics that we're talking about are complex, like violence and queerness and liberation, so it requires time for us to process. To encourage dialogue, whether through the Q&A or if you're sitting with another colleague or reflecting on your own, these pauses invite connections. And to build coalitions through openness by slowing down together, hopefully creating small acts of solidarity and community care within this learning space. So when we reach a pedagogical pause, I encourage you to consider it as an invitation to sit with a question and to sit with yourself. With that being said, let's try one out now. So first, I just want you to situate yourself in your body, to recognize your presence and your brilliance, and to take a deep breath with me. I want you to think about your entry point into this conversation. Ask yourself, what do you carry with you when you hear the word violence? What does prevention mean in your own context? What do these words mean in your own community, in your classroom, in your home? You don't have to share anything yet. I just want you to notice what rises up for you, including emotions or memories or questions. And I encourage you to let that awareness accompany you as we continue. I'm going to give you an introspective moment to sit with the questions that I'll read once more. What do you carry with you when you hear the word violence? What does prevention mean in your own context? What do these terms mean in your own community, your classroom, or your home? Okay. Many of us are familiar with violence prevention frameworks that use an ecological perspective, understanding the interrelatedness of individual, relationship, community, and societal levels. What I want to offer today is a way of deepening that model through queer ways of knowing, being, and doing. In my own research on queer and trans topics in education, I've seen how harm rarely occurs in isolation. It's ecological. It's woven across the tapestry of many different systems. Individual trauma may mirror institutional neglect, or policies that may have been written in neutrality may reproduce violence through omission. And at societal levels, we see this in legislation that erases or criminalizes queer and trans existence. So rather than thinking about violence as something that happens to someone, I invite us to think about systems that enable harm and about the forms of care that can interrupt those systems. Many of us are likely familiar with Bronfenbrenner's ecological model. The image that I'm showing here now is adapted from Bronfenbrenner by Renan Arnold to show the campus ecology. centering students within a nested campus or higher education framework. From this, we can extrapolate a little bit about violence and prevention. At the individual level, violence can look like self-silencing, or the internalized message that your safety depends on your own invisibility. At the interpersonal level, it can emerge through relationships, or bullying, or misgendering, microaggressions, coercion, or even anything really that impacts a person's sense of safety, belonging, and the warmth of climate. At the institutional level, which is especially where I sit as a campus administrator, violence can often appear through bureaucracy. Whether it's data systems that erase queer and trans existence, policies that claim neutrality but maintain inequity, or budget cuts that remove the very offices designed to keep students affirmed and safe. At the societal level, violence is often codified into law, from anti-trans legislation to defunding DEI research and initiatives, to the broader necropolitical structures that determine whose lives are grievable and whose are not. And of course, as we know, ecologically, these layers interact. And to prevent violence, we must address all of them, not as silos, but as an interdependent ecosystem. An ecological perspective encourages me to move from individual intervention to relationship strengthening and coalition building. Prevention becomes less about solely stopping an incident and more about cultivating conditions where harm is less likely to occur, because connection, representation, and belonging are inherently strong. In education, for me, that means investing in relationships, not just compliance. It means data collection that humanizes communities and doesn't surveil them. It means listening to students' stories as indicators of climate, not as outliers. And for me, it also means viewing prevention as an ongoing collective responsibility, more a practice of care that sustains safety across our ecosystems instead of a reactive bureaucratic structure. Here's another moment for pedagogical pause. I encourage you to engage in the Q&A if you'd like. I believe Sarah's monitoring that. I invite you to think in your own work or your community, where do you see violence operating ecologically and not just interpersonally? In other words, which levels, individual or relational, institutional, societal, do you think most require our attention? As you're thinking about this in your head, I encourage you to jot down some notes. You're welcome to share them. Would love especially to hear one area where prevention for you could become more relational and systemic rather than individual or reactive. I'll give you a moment to think. Okay. This is where it really gets fun. Let's talk about queerness. For me, queer epistemologies are ways of knowing that resist simplicity, that resist binaries, that resist norms. My queerness honors contradictions and complexities and especially for me, emotions as a form of knowing. When I think about violence prevention through a queer lens, I start to ask different questions. Not just solely what happened in an incident, but more broadly, who has the authority to define what harm is? Or even who individually benefits from our current definitions of safety? For me, queer ways of knowing reminds us that knowledge is not neutral, it's embodied. It's embodied in a power hierarchy. Every data point, every policy, every curriculum, every initiative carries deep assumptions about whose safety matters and what counts as violence. I want to bring in two ideas that have profoundly shaped my queer thinking, especially as an education researcher and as a college administrator whose responsibilities include all data concerning students and employees at my institution. And those two terms are radical incrementalism and queer pragmatism. Radical incrementalism asks how small evidence-based changes can accumulate into systemic transformation. In other words, how can a small collection of actions lead to liberation? Queer pragmatism holds the tension between disruption and action, between agitation and response. Combined, I find that radical incrementalism and queer pragmatism allow me to engage within the restrictive boundaries of institutions without being consumed by the dominance and power of them. In other words, radical incrementalism and queer pragmatism help me navigate the space between critique and with change. In violence prevention, incrementalism might look like improving data systems. It might look like revising reporting policies or enhancing training programs. But queerness and queer pragmatism in queer epistemologies remind us that transformation also requires disruption. It requires questioning categories and systems that they themselves may dominate, and to question how power operates through the dominance of these categories and systems. What I'm trying to emphasize here is that the challenge is to do both of these things, to move within institutions pragmatically, while also holding onto a radical imagination that keeps liberation at the center. Okay, so speaking of quantitative queers, of course, I'm going to talk about data for a little bit. So in my role leading institutional research and assessment at the University of Vermont, I live in this tension of disruption and action daily. I'm responsible for the entire data enterprise for student and employees, and I also oversee our newly developed data governance program. Especially for me as an administrator, data can be both a tool of accountability and as a mechanism of control. Queer pragmatism and my own queerness allows me to treat data as a language of care. My aim in this regard is to collect information not to surveil and control people, but to illuminate and to build trust and coalitions, to use numbers to tell stories of resilience and belonging and community, which I believe also relates to what I mentioned earlier about data sovereignty and Indigenous ways of knowing. For those of you who work in prevention, think of your own evidence that you may pull on, whether it's surveys or assessments or outcome data. And you may ask yourself, how might you treat these forms of evidence as relational practice? Because for me, evidence can be an act of love when it's used to advocate and build coalitions and not to categorize and suppress. And of course, with that, I'm going to invite you to have another pedagogical pause. I want you to ask yourselves, where in your own work do you feel the tension between small, measurable change and big systemic transformation? And what would it mean for you to hold both of these? To both act pragmatically and to dream radically. And the important thing here is to hold both of those without collapsing one into the other. I'll repeat these again, and I invite you to experience a moment of silence to think through it. Where in your work do you feel the tension between small, measurable change and big systemic transformation? And what would it mean for you to hold both of those? To act pragmatically and also to dream radically, all while not letting either of them collapse on each other. You know, sometimes as an extrovert, I feel like I can run through a script so quickly. And sometimes it's just such a joy, especially during a work day, just to like pause and sit into silence and to slow down. And so I hope you'll give me the grace of just lingering in these pedagogical pauses. I don't often get to be in the space of a learner, and I imagine the same might be true for you. So I hope you're really sitting with these questions and challenging some assumptions you have about your work. Okay. Let's shift to talk a little bit about structural implications of this conversation. I mentioned my colleague and dear friend Dolan earlier. When the two of us write together, we often talk about the necropolitical landscape of education. Necropolitics refers to systems that decide whose lives are livable, whose deaths are acceptable, and whose suffering is normalized. Especially in the US, in the recent sociopolitical climate, we see necropolitics emerging in laws that restrict gender affirming care or that promote conversion therapy, that have bans on DEI initiatives or conversations about gender in classrooms or attacks on trans athletes and educators. These aren't isolated acts of bias. They are coordinated and orchestrated efforts to systematically limit agency and to erase communities. And so I want to underscore this. When we talk about violence prevention, we must recognize that structural violence is not abstract. It is deeply embedded, it is deeply imprinted in our funding mechanisms, in our regional and federal policies, in our institutional policies, in our everyday decision making. I'm going to speak personally for a moment about grief. with recent federal attacks in the United States on queer and trans people, whether it was funding cuts from the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation, or prevention and service to people living with HIV and AIDS, to ID laws greatly affecting the rights of trans and non-binary people, and especially queer and trans undocumented and immigrant communities, to conversion therapy, and even for my area of expertise, the complete erasure of data systems that uplift queer and trans people. I'm deeply grieving right now. For me, data has always been this way of making queer and trans lives visible. For most of my career, I advocated for the expansion on how we quantify the human experience, with hopes that it would make us individually and collectively feel more seen and more valued, not just as individuals, but in policy and in funding and in state-sanctioned metrics that I thought mattered. A way of saying that my representatives understand that we exist and that we matter. And so the loss of this infrastructure occurred not just because the funding stopped and the data collection stopped, but now that those mechanisms of the state are being used to enact violence, especially on immigrant communities and trans and non-binary folks, disabled communities. So this infrastructure disruption, this infrastructural violence is much more than a professional context for many of us. It's been deeply personal. And in many ways, it felt like watching years of collective advocacy, of collective community organizing, of building grassroots solidarity and coalitions completely collapsing with a fragile and hostile and violent federal landscape in the US. The reason that I'm talking about grief, though, is that when it's held in community, when it's held with love and trust and comfort, that grief can become liberatory. It can be a way to transform despair into solidarity, into coalition building. It can transform into scrappiness and industriousness. It can transform into intersectional justice, to recognize the interrelatedness of systems of oppression in minoritized communities. So for me, grief and love are often companions. And I grieve because I care. And that care for me is what sustains my fight for better futures. Many queer scholars, including Munoz in Cruising Utopia, talk about queer futurity and world making, which is the belief that even in times of despair, we can imagine new horizons for ourselves and our communities. Even if something isn't here yet or was violently and systematically taken from us, queer futurity and world building can orient us towards possibility and towards meaning making, towards hope. In violence prevention, futurity may mean building micro utopias in the present. Maybe we can imagine a liberatory classroom environment, or an organization that embraces intersectional justice in every fiber of their community. It might be collective care that models, in a small level, the equity and justice that we want to see at scale. Radical hope for me means asking not just how do we stop harm, but how do we cultivate joy? Which for me is the greatest form of queer resistance. So in other words, prevention in this perspective, in this queer futurity, isn't only about reducing risk, it's about expanding our possibilities and our hope our radical hope for collective thriving. Okay. Heavy stuff. I hope you're taking care of yourself. And in the spirit of that, I want to take our last pedagogical pause. Would love you to take a moment to reflect quietly with yourself, to ask what practices of care, of rest, of resistance, of grief sustain you in your work? And how might those practices be part of your violence prevention strategy? I'll say it again and I'll give you a moment of silence. What practices of care, rest, resistance, grief, solidarity sustain you in your work? And how might those practices be part of your violence prevention strategy? I like this pedagogical pause, especially because it just gives us a chance to sit within our own brilliance. So as you're just reflecting on this talk, maybe now's an opportunity for you to plant your feet on the ground and to put your shoulders back and your chin up high and just take a deep breath and recognize the inherent worth that you have and the beautiful blessings that you bring to your communities and the value of us being together in community today. Okay.
Jay, someone did contribute in the Q&A. They said, going to friends for support to discuss the importance of violence prevention and to, for lack of better phrasing, blow off steam.
I love that so much. And I'm glad you shared. Feeling a connection with you right now. So good to hear your words in this space. Appreciate you. From a community organizing perspective, liberation obviously requires coalition building. Prevention work, whether it's in schools or in health systems or community organizations, none of this can happen in isolation. And of course, from an ecological perspective, we're reminded that relationships are the cornerstone, are the infrastructure, are the beginning and end of prevention work. For me in education, that means cross-unit partnerships, perhaps in student affairs and in research among faculty and staff, among community advocates and graduates, among our broader community, for me in Burlington. For public health audiences, for example, it might mean bridging clinical and policy and community work. The emphasis I'm trying to make here is that coalitions and strengthening and building communities are how small actions become systemic movements. So let's overview a few guiding practices that I've learned within liberatory prevention. Ecologically, we might think how to address harm across levels, not within silos. In other words, it's the fibers that are connecting these different structures that have the greatest potential. And of course, as a data nerd, for me, it's understanding that data must come with dignity. To gather information, not to extract data from individuals, but to collectively uplift with consent and sovereignty. Of course, for me, it means radical love, to treat care as both prevention and as pedagogy. And it means to embrace micro utopias where I have agency and interest to create spaces in classrooms or in my office, in my broader community, or whatever collective I find meaning with that models the liberation that I'm imagining. And I want to emphasize that these aren't abstract ideals. These are daily practices that, from a radical incremental perspective, slowly and persistently can shift our culture. I want to take a moment to again acknowledge the brilliance of my collaborator and friend and co-conspirator Dolan. Much of what I know about grief and about futurity and queer hope comes from their brilliance and their friendship. I also want to honor the students and co-conspirators, scholars, advocates who make this work possible for me, because prevention is not solitary, it's collective. It's born of labor and of care and imagination. And as we close, I want to return to the ecological metaphor, because none of us can transform the entire ecosystem alone, but each of us can tend to our own garden, whether it's a classroom or a policy, a relationship, or a practice. Violence prevention for me is about imagining and nurturing environments where everyone can live, learn, love, and thrive without fear. And epistemologically, from a queer perspective, it's about loving ambiguity and complexity and disruption and how connection can lead us there. Not necessarily just to solutions, but greater meaning. So thanks for being a part of the conversation today, especially for the pedagogical pauses, for the work that you do, and for the futures that you help make possible. I'm really grateful to be here.
Jay, thank you so much for such a fantastic and insightful presentation. I know there's a lot of takeaways that I'll bring into my own work, and I have a couple questions for you as we leave the Q&A open for participants to add.
Sure.
I always find the question about like what do you do to care for yourself or sustain yourself to be such a beautiful, insightful one. And I'm curious, what are your strategies?
When I started my career trajectory, became very passionate about data. And honestly, I'm going to say this with humility, never thought that data and education would be so highly politicized in the United States. And it's been so violent on my own wellness. And so I've had to take radical acts of self-care in the past few months just to endure my professional life. In small ways, I've started mindfulness every morning. And so for 15 minutes, I use an app called Healthy Minds to understand how my own inherent worth and the blessings that others bring to me can ground me with intention. The axis of my life for so long was driven by my professional worth as well. And when I met my partner in 2018, when we got married last year, all through those years, it's been such a gift to reframe the axis of my fulfillment, not just on our relationships, but of myself. And so it's been just like a frame of being to understand that what is going to endure for me is the love that my husband and I have for each other. And that happens in small ways, like committing to not working after 5 o'clock, or to really listen with intention to the words that he shares with me, and like to acknowledge them as gifts. Because I think like I have the burden of listening at work so often that I feel like listening can feel like an obligation at times. And it's often the people that we love that can receive that impact. And so it's like been reframing my husband sharing his words with me as like a gift and as a blessing too, which has really honestly totally transformed how I think about myself and how I think about relationships.
That that is so beautifully put, and I think even gives me some things to reflect on and to work on with my own practice. I know stopping work by 5 is hard, but I agree it's such an
Yeah.
important thing to do. It's one of those things where you're like, "Can I actually do this?" And you're like, "Well, of course I can," but it matters so much, but it seems
Yeah.
like something so small.
Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I
As a
also
fact,
oh, sorry. Continue, please.
as a faculty member, I felt like I had so much space to think. And now as an administrator, I sometimes have 15-minute meetings put on my schedule.
Yeah.
It's just, it's a gauntlet at
Yeah.
times. And I like the work, but even in small ways, blocking off 45 minutes for lunch is just like transformative for me.
Yeah.
And, you know, I went outside today and I ate my soup on the sidewalk and just like enjoyed some sunshine. It's gorgeous right now in Vermont. So, yeah, those things are really, I thought they didn't matter, but it's again back to like radical incrementalism, the cumulative impact of reorienting my time to center those experiences. Game changer. Game changer.
Absolutely. And it's the things we take for granted so often that end up being so
Yeah.
important.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the other thing I was wondering, and I really like it, but it's not a term I had worked with before, is radical incrementalism.
Yeah.
Can you give me some practical examples of that? Because that is such a powerful thing that I had never thought about before.
So obviously, data is the belle of the ball for me in many regards as a scholar and as an institutional research director. When I came into this position, I just had grand ideas. I wanted to shake the entire ecosystem so that data would be leveraged as a liberation strategy. And I think that grandeur got me burnt out in the beginning and a little cynical. And that, honestly, then I found radical incrementalism. And it resonated much more with me as an administrator than I ever would have as a faculty member, because it gave me something to hold on to with hope. And so when I started, I wanted to completely overhaul how our data systems collected all social identities. I wanted to radically transform our conceptualization of gender in our rigid, federally compliant data records. And I started this massive project called the Lived Identity Project on campus to bring together enrollment management and HR and IT and all of these systems. And I was like, okay, let's transform everything. And then people are like, well, we don't have a data warehouse. This would require a different enterprise system. Well, it's a huge liability. We're not compliant with federal reporting anymore. And I'm like, okay. I wanted people to suspend reality and say, like, dream with me, imagine. And when that wasn't possible for a lot of people, it was these incremental steps that let me hold on to my radical sensibilities. It was introducing open-ended demographic questions in surveys because my office controlled surveys. It was creating the Data Governance Council and creating a data bill of rights so that people understood their inherent privacy rights. It was building trust by visiting the Student Government Association and talking about how their student records are used to make decisions. And like those small acts together, I hope are creating a wave of like influence in moving towards data as a liberatory strategy. But I don't need everyone to buy into that grand idea. I just need people to invest in those small moments, which I hope will accumulate eventually.
That's so well put, and it is so true in the sense that you can't change everything, but you can change little things that
Yep.
start to change the bigger things.
Yep. And it's a reckoning that I've had as a white person, and especially as a white cisgender man, because often incrementalism might be seen as a tool of white supremacy, because we may use the excuse of small change to circumvent large systemic transformation. And so it's a line, again, it's in queer ambiguity, For me to just put all this on the table and say, this is messy, and this is how I'm navigating it with honesty and transparency. And I'd love to talk with others about how you're navigating it so that it then doesn't become driven by systemic dominant assumptions, but really by relationality and humility.
So important. I like both how you draw in the idea too of that transparency to address some systemic issues, but also even like indigenous ways of knowing and being in terms
Yeah.
of relational understandings and that.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's so important and powerful. We did have a question come in from the audience.
Okay, great.
Stefan says, great presentation, Jay. Any guidance on conducting queer research with partners from different countries despite differences in policies/laws regarding queer health and research? Wondering especially when working alongside researchers in countries where it is illegal or stigmatized to be queer.
Thank you so much for the question. A lot of solidarity and love for that one. The broader aim of QTPiE is to build coalitions. And so when we have the blessing of an organization reaching out to us to partner, it feels like such a gift. And that recently happened for us with an organization in Singapore to understand how queer and trans people thrive in their post-secondary institutions. And before we begin talking about methods, about metrics, about products, we first start with relationship and community building, getting to know each other and our intentions of the work. And then I take deep, deep time to learn with humility what I don't know about the existing ecosystem. And honestly, this is going to sound like I stage this, but I frame my questions from an ecological perspective. And so I first want to know, like, what are the unspoken interpersonal norms of queer and trans communities? What is it that I don't know as someone who lives in the US? And then I go into, okay, can you talk a little bit more about the structure of higher education in Singapore and how institutional policies intersect with federal policy or with other national contexts? And then I get into larger socio-political questions about laws and policies that govern the lives of queer and trans communities. Some tangible things that I would also encourage you to consider. I have a partnership guidelines document that I share and we agree upon together that really makes transparent the power assumptions inherent in a relationship. And I especially articulate as a tenured faculty in the US, as a white cis man, I don't want the power landscape to permit me to abuse the privileges of partnering with certain organizations. And so we talk about how we can check ourselves and check in with each other about assumptions we're making. And those tension points often happen with finances or with products that matter, like research publications. And so we'll be really intentional about developing a loose and evolving contract about how money will be shared, how authorship will be decided, how recognition will be honored, and stuff like that. And it's worked out really well.
That's great. Is that partnership document something that you share, or is that more internal to your work?
It's largely internal, but if someone wants to reach out to me personally, I'd be very happy to share with
Stefan says, thank you very much.
you. Sure. My pleasure.
All right. I think that brings us to the ends of the question and the end of the webinar. So thank you, Jay, truly. I love all the webinars. I found this one particularly inspiring and insightful. So truly, thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Appreciate you all.